This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Institute of Historical Research. My name is Lawrence Goldman. I'm the director here, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the fifth Holocaust Memorial Lecture, shared jointly between the IHR and the Pears Institute at Birkbeck College, London, which is next door. We've had 5 lectures. This is the first down here in the refurbished Institute, and I'm very delighted to see the Wolfson Room so full with people this evening. Tonight we will have a lecture, and there will also be an opportunity for questions afterwards, and my colleague from Birkbeck, David Feldman, will conduct the questions and also give a vote of thanks afterwards. But it's my job to introduce the lecturer and his subject, which is a very great pleasure indeed. Michael Wildt is Professor of Modern German History at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where he's been since 2009. He spent the previous 30 years, he tells me, in Hamburg, and it was there, in fact, that he studied as well as a student. There are 2 of his recent publications I'd like to draw to your attention, not least because they are published in English. The first, published in 2009, is entitled An Uncompromising Generation, the Nazi Leadership of the Reich Security Main Office. But more recently, in 2012, he published the book Hitler's Volksgemeinschaft and the Dynamics of Racial Exclusion, Violence Against Jews in Provincial Germany, 1919 to 1939. And it's that book that forms the thesis and subject for this evening's lecture, which, as you know, is entitled Antisemitism, Volksgemeinschaft and Violence, Inclusion and Exclusion in Nazi Germany. It's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Wildt to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation by Pears Institute and the Institute of Historical Research. And thank you very much for coming tonight. And I do hope we have afterwards, after my lecture, an opportunity for discussion and question. The boat was old and rickety, but the people smugglers declared that they had nothing better to offer. They pushed the small vessel into the water and bid the passengers farewell. But the refugees didn't get far that night, although they could already see the distant lights of safety on the opposite shore. Water was leaking into the boat and it soon capsized. It was October and the water was cold. Just a few people survived, and only because a fishing boat happened to pass by. The fishermen heard the cries for help and came to pick up the refugees. This story took place not in the Mediterranean Sea of the 2015, but back in 1943. The refugees weren't Arabs escaping the horrors of civil war. It was Danish Jews seeking safety in Sweden. In one of the most spectacular rescue campaigns of the Holocaust, many ordinary Danes risked their own lives to save almost every member of the local Jewish minority from the clutches of the German occupation, providing them with secret passage to Sweden on all kinds of boats. At this point in time, Eastern Europe had already seen millions of Jews killed by shootings and beatings, as well as by gassings, in the extermination camps of Auschwitz, Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibor. It had only been 10 years since the National Socialists had won their great victories in the German elections, with Hitler coming to power in January 1933. However, the history of the persecution of the Jews in Germany does not begin with 1933, and it would certainly be worth discussing whether there had already existed a long tradition of Judeophobia stretching from the Middle Ages to the Holocaust, an ever-present violence against Jews that reached its catastrophic climax with the genocide in World War II. In any case, a decisive watershed in the development of mass murder during the 20th century was certainly represented by World War I, whose violence was on an unprecedented scale. The Western Front saw millions of French, British, and German soldiers dying in fruitless battles. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe also saw massive violence perpetrated against civilian population, and even back then these often came in form of ethnic cleansings. Then, in 1917, the Russian Revolution led to the collapse of the Tsarist regime and the expansion of nationalist movements. The civil war on the territory of the former Russian Empire also saw brutal anti-Semitic pogroms, forcing 10,000 of Jews to flee for Western Europe or the United States. World War I was a crucible that sharply defined the limits of affiliation and community, hardening the borders between included and excluded, friend and foe. In Germany, the sentiment expressed by Emperor Wilhelm II in 1914 that he no longer recognized political parties but simply Germans was a simple but apt summation of the situation, underlining not only the political necessity of mobilizing the entire population behind the war effort, but also the need for including and integrating individuals within a larger whole, which was also a desire of Social Democrats and German Jews too. Even though class conflict soon re-emerged in wartime society and the old anti-Semitic sentiments once again become common, the notion of Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, never did lose its magic, with its promise for a better future based on a mystic past. In the early 20th century, one saw the term folk, or people, claiming more and more space from the German term Nation, nation. Folk, people, has more flexible meanings, which is precisely what it made more attractive than nation, which itself was loaded with ambivalences connected with the nation state and the Kulturnation, meaning both cultured nation and cultural nation, and unavoidable harked back to the French nation with its birth in revolution. The idea of nation was strongly connected in Germany with the idea of state, much more so than the idea of folk was. And the term folk and people was much better than the nation, nation, for conveying an agenda of ethnification, biological determinism, and social Darwinism. Eric Hobsbawm pointed out how ethnic membership and semantic usage make central criteria for defining the nation at the end of the 19th century, and that in particular those special interest groups who declared themselves to be a folk or a nation, but without having their own separate state, generally based their claim on an ethnic argument. In contrast to the French or the British, the Germans had long been divided into many small states, and thus could not define themselves as a classical nation state, making them particularly susceptible to the ethnicizing ideology of the folk. The concept of the Volk, of the people, as demos, which is central to a civil society based on the ideals of constitutional solidarity and the rule of law, is contrasted with the idea of Volk, of people, as ethnos, which combines imaginary shared genetic inheritances, mystic histories and fantasies about shared blood and soil. It was with the emergence of biological determinism that the alterity of the other became formalized as a fact of nature, so that simple genealogical details became unescapable genetic incompatibilities, which by definition cannot be assimilated. As a result, the former project of assimilation became replaced by an ultimately genocidal policies of segregation and elimination. The sociologist Helmut Plessner, an astute observer of the period, quite rightly remarked in 1924 that Gemeinschaft, community, was the ideal of this epoch. Nearly all political parties advocated the Volksgemeinschaft as a political program. Their respective concepts were, however, marked by differences that were at this time fundamental, at times merely a question of degree. The liberals, for example, you see a poster of the leftist German liberals for a party from the election in 1932, a party most of the German Jews are voting for this liberal party, for unity, progress, Volksgemeinschaft. Nearly all the liberals proposed a conception of Volksgemeinschaft that was meant to negate notions of class struggles and encourage the social unity of the nation. Similarly, the German Catholics, which saw itself as a broadly based Christian party that explicitly stands for the German Volksgemeinschaft. It's a quotation from the political program of the German so-called Center Party. And even the Social Democrats flirted with the notion of Volksgemeinschaft. The instability after the collapse of the German Empire, in which the Social Democrats took up the political mantle, but felt threatened by revolutionary leftists and their attempted rebellions, led to a rhetoric of domestic cohesion, unity, and reaction of any divisiveness. For the Social Democrats, the working class had, in the course of the history, became the large majority of the populace. They juxtaposed that majority of the working people with a small minority of entrepreneurs and estate owners, one that was unjustifiably powerful. So this majority of the working people in the perspective of Social Democrats are equal with this notion Volksgemeinschaft. In the political discourse of the Weimar Republic, a significant characteristic of the Volksgemeinschaft idea was clearly its potential for translating the unity of the people, die Einheit des Volkes, into homogeneity. This is why the concept resonated in so many ways for the political right, which was similarly promoting its vision of Volksgemeinschaft. However, their ideal of homogeneity was primarily geared towards eliminating any political diversity, while also defining membership in the Gemeinschaft, in the community, through racist categorizations, which ultimately meant achieving homogeneity through violent means. The notion of Volksgemeinschaft was a central significance in Hitler's worldview. The Nazi Party presented itself as a youthful Volksparty and a 110 party, one that appealed to all classes, and Hitler took on the charismatic role of a leader for the entire people, dedicated to fulfilling people's yearning for both continuity and change, and for unity and salvation within a future Volksgemeinschaft. And despite all the rhetoric of inclusion propounded by the political right, their version of the Volksgemeinschaft was in fact defined by limits and exclusions. The right was less concerned with who belonged to the Volksgemeinschaft and more concerned with who could not belong, meaning those who were already be semantically ostracized as Gemeinschaftsfremde, as aliens to the community, which primarily meant, of course, the Jews. Here, antisemitism played the central role. In this construction of the folk as a natural, blood-based community that was striving to define its own political system, the racist and anti-Semitic borders became inextricably embedded. Anti-Semitism was the founding bedrock of the National Socialist Volksgemeinschaft, intensifying its radical nature and its destructive potential. The Nazi Party platform of 1920 explicitly stated that, quote, one can be a citizen only if one is a Volksgenosse, a folk comrade. One can be a Volksgenosse only if one of German blood, regardless of religious confession. Therefore, no Jew can be a Volksgenosse. Quote end. Antisemitism is the main criterion differentiating the notion of Volksgemeinschaft from a competing one that harks back to the spirit of the 1914 the German imperial state that they are. Because in this public wartime Euphoria, it was explicit inclusive of all Germans, even social democrats and Jews, who furthermore hoped that their show of patriotism would ultimately lead to their acceptance to mainstream society. Correspondingly, anti-Semitism and the National Socialist version of Volksgemeinschaft were so intertwined that those who felt a resonance with this Nazi promise of inclusion and who, moreover, agreed with the Nazis' Volksgemeinschaft propaganda after 1933, also took the Nazi stance of anti-Semitic exclusion, even though they might not have been anti-Semites before. After coming to power, the National Socialists took the cultivation of this Volksgemeinschaft as their primary mission, to be pursued even out in the provinces, villages, and smaller settlement. That meant drawing a racist border through local populations, trampling on civil society's existing legal system, and implementing the grassroots expulsion of Jews as a first step towards the ultimate removal of the Jews. Volksgemeinschaft policies were first and foremost policies against the Jews in the local neighborhood, as well as other aliens to community members of foreign races, migrant workers. This is a build from the so-called boycott on the 1st of April in 1933, and I choose this picture, this photograph, because you'll see in this photograph how these pictures were prepared by the Nazi propagandists. You see the cameraman over on the right who is just taking a picture of this SR men who are That's in the middle and in the morning of this 1st of April. If you have a look at other pictures of this boycott, you will see that that these pictures have been made in the night before, so that the great photo agencies have got pictures for their first issues of the newspaper, especially for the foreign press. So what's astonishing, some of these pictures, that these SR men are carrying posters with English sentence, and that was made only for the foreign press. That at the time, the New York Times, Washington Post, and all the others, the Sunday Times will bring these pictures in their newspapers to see and to make evidence for their readers that the Germans are standing just behind the new National Socialist government. So, in terms of political practice on the ground, the first step was to create distance by stigmatizing any signs of solidarity or with compassion for the persecuted Jews. In order to isolate these Jewish neighbors, they declare them to be legally disenfranchised or even outlawed. The boycott of Jewish businesses on the April the 1st in 1933 was suspended after one day in the big cities, which had stronger control through police and foreign observers. However, in the provinces, in the small towns and villages, the boycott opened a political arena in which the local chapters of the SS, the SR, and the Nazi Party could influence the social, cultural, and political patterns of the community. The boycott allowed experimentation with various forms of activism, such as putting up street posters or banners, standing guard outside Jewish shops, directly asking customers not to enter such shops, or even using insults and violence. And in addition to this violent boycott activities, in the summer of 1935, it's only 2 years after the coming the Nazis to power, also saw increasing campaigns to denounce miscegenation with Jewish partners as race defilement. That this German non-Jewish young women have a poster. I'm a German girl and have been defiled by a Jew. Yeah, it's just a small town in northern Germany. At this time, about 8,000 inhabitants, and it was a couple who want to marry, and you see that the picture was made by the owner of the drugstore in Norden, and he was a member of the Nazi Party, and he exhibited the photographs in his window shop, and you could buy these photographs there with him. So it was public, not only public. The march was public to see the youngsters around them, and the pictures afterwards was public in this small northern German city. These marches, you see that this photograph gives evidence. These marches pass through busy streets in broad daylight. Looking at the photo documentation, one noticed that the crowds, including women, young women, children, and teenagers, who walked alongside while laughing, teasing, insulting, and spitting at the victims. One cannot overlook their voyeuristic pleasure, as well as their agreement and participation in punishing this transgression against so-called racial honor. With these 1935 campaigns against race defilement, Rassenschande, the National Socialists obviously had found a field of everyday life in which they could effectively draw a border around the Volksgemeinschaft with full consent of their fellow Volksgenossen. So the November pogrom in 1938 was, and the explosion of violence stemming from a militant corps were accompanied by numerous accomplices and supporters who all had free rein to insult and abuse Jewish people, while also plundering their properties. Plundering was a huge event in these 2 nights in Germany, and of course in all the reports of the Gestapo, the plundering has been minimized because it was obviously not not against the rules the Nazi government was implementing, because it should be only in a strike against the Jewish minority, that so many people, German people, are plundering Jewish property was not in the intention of the Gestapo, though the reports minimized this plundering. But looking more deeply in the sources, you see how many property was stolen and robbed in this November night. There were eager spectators, curious onlookers, and passers-by. But whatever their private opinions might have been, and so therefore I choose this photograph from the 10th of November, the day after the pogrom. But whatever the private opinions might have been, these people represented an essential element to this day, passing by to this distracted shops and windows and looted business, and doing as well as everyday life as business as usual, is really astonishing. This action took place in full public view precisely in order to change this public view and fundamentally so. Such an event compels a response no matter that. At the very least, one had to leave the scene immediately in order to avoid becoming part of the proceeding and an accomplice to anti-Semitic violence. The individual motivation may well have been very diverse. Greed, envy, and simple malice could have been fired participants equally as much as an explicit hatred of Jews. Even with clearly anti-Semitic motivation, there have been variations in rationale and intention. Therefore, joint action does not necessarily indicate shared motivations or even similar worldviews. Nonetheless, the exercise of violence tended to gloss over potential differences in the motivation that drove individual participants towards collective action. No matter what the intention was, the violence was also always directed against the Jews. Everybody could join in and take part without needing to assume individual responsibility or leadership. Even the most cowardly could punch, kick, and otherwise exercise violence without fear of retaliation from the victim. The community served to multiply the violence against the victim and minimize the perpetrator's fear of being hurt himself or suffering injuries to his own body. These violent campaigns against the Jews in Germany did not themselves create the Volksgemeinschaft, but the exercise of violence did anticipate the reality of the Volksgemeinschaft, even if limited in time and space. It gave self-empowerment concrete form. even making it physically tangible by suspending the old order and allowing the establishment of a new political order of racist inequality. The abrogation of the Weimar Republic's constitutional status quo in 1933 offered numerous elites the so-called enabling spaces they had long desired. The doctor was finally permitted to heal the German Volkskörper, the German body politic, by the law of the so-called prevention of genetically defected offspring that was enacted in July 1933, which allowed for the first time in Germany the sterilization of patients even against their will. The newly convened genetic health courts, each consisting of a judge and two physicians, examined some 224,000 cases in the first 3 years alone, and ordered sterilization to some 190,000 cases. That means around 90%. I think it's an incredible number, and you see the participation of so many physicians in Germany in genetically racist practice. There had been no Gestapo policemen after them with a pistol on their head to judge in this way. That 90% of these cases are judged to forced violent sterilization, even against the will of the victims. Police officers, finally freed from legislative and judicial limitation, believed that they could now achieve a society without criminals, and eagerly accepted theory of criminal biology that racially defines certain social groups as antisocial elements, justifying their internment at concentration camps and ultimately their elimination. Local welfare officers no longer classified their clients according to neediness, but instead according to employability, under the promise that those who cannot work need not eat. Here too, racist criteria were soon used to differentiate between those who were useful to the Volksgemeinschaft and those who were alien to it. With a new tax law of 1934, whose first paragraph bluntly stated that tax regulation must conform to the National Socialist principles, even tax collectors were freed from the principle of all citizens receiving equal treatment before the law, and could now apply arbitrary and unequal treatment, meaning additional tax burdens, especially for Jews. Thus, Volksgemeinschaft also signified an individual self-empowerment with a racist opening of new possibilities for action. In his insightful analysis, Richard Evans described the network of Nazi Party functionaries within the Third Reich. The terror apparatus of the Nazi regime reached into even the smallest niche of everyday life and the working world. Nazi Party included some 200,000 leading officials known as politische Leiter, as well as some 2 million Blockwarte or block wardens, all charged with supervising the general population. The workplaces were similarly monitored by officials of the German Labor Front, foremen, and other representatives. That the regime had such an immense pool of functionaries, assistants, and helpers reflects a high degree of participation. Beyond the more than 4 million members enrolled in the Nazi National Socialist Party in late 1933. There were some 22 million in the German Labor Front, 14 million in the National Socialist Volksgemeinschaft, which was a public welfare organization, around 9 million young people in the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, and more than 1 million women in the National Socialist Women's League. So, for this, I think that I showed this picture because I think it's a really astonishing one how these two teachers trained these children, the Deutschen Gruß. One of my colleagues, Armin Neulzen, estimated that by the time war broke out, around two-thirds of the German populace were members of either a Nazi party organization or one that was controlled by the Nazi party. 90% of the functionaries worked on voluntary basis. It would be difficult to interpret this huge number of supporters as simply part of a governmental terror network for the repression of society. It seems more plausible to consider this multiplicity of posts, positions, and sinecures as a system enabling people to take part in a regime that conversely was able to rely on the assistance and participation of so many to maintain the established political order. Volksgemeinschaft did not only mean a feeling of belongingness or community. For a great many in Germany, it also meant increased status, because as members of the German Volksgemeinschaft, they felt elevated above Jews and Roma, so-called antisocial elements, and Gemeinschaftsfremde, aliens to community. Volksgemeinschaft meant self-empowerment through exclusion. And it also meant making demands for things that the German folk was ostensibly entitled to, above all, Lebensraum or living space. The idea that a people needed a particular space in order to feed and develop itself was certainly not a specifically Nazi concept. Similar delusions were also the basis of both the French and the British imperialism. However, the idea acquired a particular stridency in Germany due to the World War I and the subsequent loss of territory. From the viewpoint of racial biology, the war killed a huge number of Germany's bravest and best young men, while allegedly inferior in persons survived the war. And from an ethno-nationalist viewpoint, the loss of German colonies meant that there might no longer be enough relevant on food imports and still wars. During the British naval blockade on World War I, this led to drastic rations cutbacks and food riots, which later motivated the Nazi leadership to consistently pursue a policy of self-sufficiency, even by ruthlessly plundering occupied territories to ensure that the German populace had enough food. However, Hitler's solution to this problem was not the recovery of the former colonies, as demanded by many German nationalists. For him, the ethno-nationalist territory policy was to be realized not in Africa, but towards the east on Russian territory. And like the Teutonic Knights before them, the German armies were to march upon the east once again in order to conquer new Lebensraum, establish German settlements, and subjugate the local inhabitants as slave labor. This Lebensraum policy would not accept the current European borders, and Hitler wrote quite openly in his book Mein Kampf. He wrote that and I quote him, "Political frontiers must not keep us away from the frontiers of eternal right. If this earth really has room enough for all to live in, then one should give us the space that we need for living. One will certainly not like to do this. One will certainly not like to do this. Then, however, the right of self-preservation comes into effect. And what has been denied to kindness will have to be taken by the fist." Quote end. For anyone reading Mein Kampf back then, it was clear that the pursuit of Nazi policy would lead to war. In the spring of 1939, Hitler made it unmistakably clear to his generals why it was necessary to attack Poland. He said that the goal was the consolidation of Lebensraum in the East. His secret pact treaty with Stalin in August 1939 not only enabled the war, but also spelled out the imperialist partitioning of Poland between Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, the fourth partitioning of Poland in modern times. According to the plans of the Nazi leadership, Poland would become a German settlement zone. Now, choose a picture of Warsaw in autumn of 1933, so you can imagine how the bombing, the severe bombings of the Polish capital had been destroyed a large part of the time. And it's not something incredible in Germany, because there in Germany there's a lot of pictures of destroyed cities, and of course always the German cities pictured which have been destroyed. So it's sometimes necessary to saw Warsaw, Rotterdam, Belgrade, and Coventry, of course, and London, to see how much bombings, German bombings, have destroyed European city in the times. In the words of Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Gestapo and the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the ruling class in Poland should be made as harmless as possible, which ultimately meant mass execution in concentration camps, internments. The Polish populace was to be deported and or exploited as a labor reservoir, while the Polish Jews were to be delivered into a Jewish reservation. Tens of thousands of Poles were murdered, not only by the SS and the police and the Einsatzgruppen that was especially established to follow the German Wehrmacht in Poland, but even more by the Wehrmacht too, and even more by armed militias of the local ethnic German minority in Poland. The Polish historian Bogdan Musil estimates that by the end of 1939 alone, well over 45,000 Polish civilians have been killed within the German occupation zone, including some 7,000 Jews. In October 1939, Hitler designated Heinrich Himmler to take on a major assignment called the Festigung deutschen Volkstums, or consolidation of German Volkdom. According to this central degree, it's sometimes not really mystified, but had been get outside the focus on historians in former time. But nowadays we know definitely how central this assignment was for this development of power for the SS. According to this decree, this involved, quote, the bringing back of those ethnic Germans and German citizens abroad who were eligible for a final homecoming to the Reich, as well as, second, elimination of harmful influences by those alien population segments that represent a threat to the Reich and the German Volksgemeinschaft, and third, the establishment of new German settlement areas through relocations, especially through the settlement of ethnic Germans and German citizens who are returning home from abroad. And this decree was the basement for Himmler and the SS for settlement policy and for elimination policy on the other side. Taking on the title of a Reich Commissioner for the consolidation of German Volkdom, Hitler soon outlined his plan. The annexed western Polish provinces would see the deportation of all Jewish inhabitants, around 500,000 people, along with an yet underdetermined number of especially hostile Polish population who would all be sent into a territory on the so-called General to central Poland, nearly 1 million people in total. However, this deportation program would encounter some real obstacles. The German railway company couldn't provide enough trains, and the general government authorities, the central Polish occupation authorities, were soon complaining that they couldn't feed or house so much deportees. In March 1940, the deportation were temporarily suspended and the Polish Jews were crammed into ghettos until a future date when they could be transported. Of this highly ambitious expulsion and resettlement plans of 1939 and 1940, only a small part could actually be implemented. Again and again, the plans were either reduced or subdivided into primary or intermediate phases. However, the obstacles they encountered did not stop the Nazi perpetrators. On the contrary, it prompted them to use even the more radical methods to force a solution. With the Nazi victory over France in the spring 1940, they re-emerged an old anti-Semitic plan of deporting Jews to Madagascar, a plan that already exhibited genocidal tendency since the island in hospital living conditions were already known, and there was no way it could have accommodated millions of arrivals. But as long as England was undefeated, the Madagascar plan would have to remain a pipe dream, because you need ships and a free shipping area to bring millions of people from Europe to Madagascar. And if Great Britain are still ruling the oceans, there's no way for such a deportation plan. Nonetheless, the Nazi leadership seriously discussed it for months, further demonstrating their anti-Semitic obsession. With the launch of the Lebensraum War against the Soviet Union in 1941, the exterminatory character of the National Socialism became brilliantly clear. In his instruction of early March 1941, addressed to the Alfred Jodl, the Wehrmacht chief of staff, Hitler openly stated his intention with this war, writing that, quote, "The upcoming campaign is more than just a battle of weapons. It also represents the confrontations between two worldviews. The Judeo-Bolshevist intelligentsia, as an oppressor of the folk until now, must be eliminated," unquote. From the very start, the Nazi and Wehrmacht leadership was planning to commit war crimes. The so-called Commissar Order on June 41, which stated that every political officer of the Red Army was to be summarily executed and not taken prisoner, violated all prevailing laws of war, as did the May 1941 decree that German soldiers who committed acts of violence against civilian populace were to be exempted from facing a martial court for this. But it was above all the decision to make absolutely no provision for the million of Soviet prisoners of war that were soon expected, and to simply look them up in primitive camps and leave them to their fate, ultimately leading to the death of almost 2 million Soviet prisoners of war by starvation and disease. That is itself represented a massive war crime of monstrous proportion for which the Wehrmacht bore sole responsibility. In regard to the Soviet civilian population, too, the German leadership had also developed a criminal plan commonly known as the Hunger Plan. The headquarters in Berlin had calculated that an attacking army of 3 million German soldiers rapidly advancing into Soviet territory could not be fed by the usual supply lines. Therefore, the instructions stated that German soldiers were to live off the land. The Soviet Union itself had only limited food supplies. Therefore, as was coldly written in the minutes of a state secretary meeting from May 1941, this meant that, quote, millions of people would certainly starve if we take what we need for ourselves from the land. So even the bureaucrats and the high-ranking bureaucrats in the German administration in the spring 1941 are dealing with mass murder, calculating the death of millions of people who were certainly will be dead by starvation. The German expected a quick victory, after which the Jews would be deported to the east. At the same time, a radical assignment was planned for the SS Einsatzgruppen in this war of worldviews, namely the liquidation of so-called Judeo-Bolshevism by murdering Soviet officials of the party and state along with the members of the intelligentsia. In March 1941, Hitler mandated Heinrich Himmler with an extraordinary power to fulfill special tasks commissioned by the Führer. This formed the political basis for the Einsatzgruppen to act with far-reaching executive powers and the greatest possible freedom from Wehrmacht control. Deciding who exactly was part of the Judeo-Bolshevist intelligentsia would be done exclusively by the SS and the police leadership. And so you see this photo that the people are hanged as so-called partisans. And what's interesting is that there are so many of them are Wehrmacht soldiers. They are so near to the execution and to the victims. And you see the cameras all over there. They're taking picture from this scene. With the decision in September 1941 to deport German and Austrian Jews in the occupied Polish and Soviet territories, even as the war was still happening, the last barrier to all-out genocide has fallen. So the brutal condition caused by the Nazis' own action, such as diseases, epidemics, raging through ghettos where people had been forced to live with inadequate food and disastrous hygienic condition, along with the labeling of unemployable Jews as creatures whose very existence was considered a burden on food supplies of both of the Wehrmacht and to the home front, were taken by the perpetrators as justification for implementing genocide as a logical solution to a problem. Again, the real-world failures of these Nazi deportation programs did not prompt a change in goals, but rather a renewed determination to achieve them at all costs with increasingly radical means. The systematic gassing of inmates of the ghettos began in early December 1941 at Kelno, near the city of Lodz. That's a photo from Auschwitz nowadays. In Lodz, the local SS commander had established a killing center using gas vans, which featured a sealed compartment into which exhaust fumes were piped from the engine. That had followed a request sent back in October from the local Gauleiter Arthur Greiser to Heinrich Himmler, asking for permission to execute 100,000 Jews labeled unfit for work. It would also appear that in the mid-October, Himmler had already assigned Odilo Globachnik, the SS and police leader in Lublin, with the establishment of a regional extermination camp at Brzeź. That was followed in March 1942 by the building of the Sobibor extermination camp in the Treblinka. The evacuations of the Jewish ghettos in Poland also began in March, with inmates taken by train to the extermination camps, where they were immediately murdered in the gas chambers. At Auschwitz, the first murders with Zyklon B were committed against Soviet prisoners of war in September 1941, and then by July 2022 there were regular arrivals of train delivering deported Jews from all over Western Europe. After a visit to Auschwitz in July 1942, Himmler decreed that by the end of the war, on the end of the year, there would be no more Jews on the territory of Poland. At Treblinka alone, more than 250,000 people from the Warsaw Ghetto were gassed in just a few weeks, including all the children who were seen by the Germans as particularly unsuitable for forced labor. In this horrifying month, from July to November 1942, well over 2 million people fell victim to the systematic mass murder. The war in the East provided a suitable space for this radicalization process to descend into genocide. Within the German Reich itself, there still existed plenty of legal and administrative obstacles that the perpetrators have to overcome. But there existed no such barriers of an orderly civil society in the East, a zone that Timothy Snyder famously called the Bloodlands, which had been permeated with violence since the start of the century, and where hardly any state structures still existed. Notions of modernity, like bureaucratization or the increasing regulation of social interaction, became lost in regards to the actions committed by the Nazi regime in the East. The project of conquering a colonial Lebensraum in Eastern Europe, of not only reconstructing Germany itself in racial terms, but also of reorganizing all Europe according to racist ideals, this obsession with not only imagining alternative ideal worlds, but also with making them a horrifying reality, had turned most of the German functional elites into willing supporters of the Nazi regime. It was only through the enormous military efforts of the Allies, costing millions of Soviet, British, and American soldiers their lives, that Nazi Germany could finally be defeated, putting an end to its criminal regime. The 27th of January 1945, the day that Auschwitz was liberated, will always be a date that reminds us not only to the inconceivable crimes that people are capable of committing, but also of how much we owe to those who ultimately smashed Hitler's Germany. Had there actually been any possibility of averting this catastrophic war? The increasing radical policies enacted against the German Jews after Hitler came to power certainly had registered in the public consciousness of other countries. In view of the swelling numbers of refugees from Germany and Austria, as well as the limited intake capacities of potential immigration countries, US President Roosevelt proposed the negotiation of a common quota framework. However, the international conference that took place in July 1938 in the French spa town of Vienna, Le Bain et de Geneva, it became clear that the participating countries were either unable or unwilling to take in the refugees. Instead of caring for the persecuted people in Germany and Austria, many countries pointed out their own Jewish problem and demanded that their own Jews should also emigrate as quickly as possible. Only the Dominican Republic offered to take in large numbers, up to 100,000 Jews, although with dubious and racist motives as the dictator Trujillo, who also wanted to increase the white percentage of his population. And in the end, no more than 600 Jewish refugees made it to this Caribbean country. All the other countries were unprepared to increase the immigration quotas for the refugees. And even the United States, who had actually convened the conference, kept their upper limit of around 27,000 immigrants per year from Germany and Austria. After the violence of the November pogrom, some months later, only the United Kingdom showed itself willing to take in some 10,000 Jewish children from German and Austrian families, placing them in British foster families. And the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Sweden, and Switzerland also followed the British example, so that another 2,000 Jewish children could also be saved. On January 1939, Hitler gave a speech at the German Reichstag calling upon the European powers to provide a solution to the Jewish question, and ending with a threat if war should come, the result would not be the Bolshevization of the world, but rather the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. In March 1939, Germany violated the Munich Agreement by occupying the remainder Czechoslovakia. Half a year later, the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland. And with the launch of the war, the solution of the Jewish question would now progress into a systematic mass murder. The collective act of violence against the Jews was not only a brutal act of excluding the other, it also served to build a Gemeinschaft, a community, but one that did not define itself through laws which could have always set limits. Instead, it was a community that only created itself through action. The Nazi regime communalized the violence, allowing its Volksgenossen to participate. Every act of violence broke through barriers and altered the system, because these acts could now happen without fear of legal penalties. There was a system in which new opportunities of action became available, one that had never been available before. Therefore, discussing Volksgemeinschaft always means talking about inclusion and exclusion, about mobilization and participation as well as selection, about taking a slice and empowering the self, and also about violence, annihilation, and murder. Volksgemeinschaft means the practice of racism in both inclusive and exclusive terms, especially in everyday life, in which countless Volksgenossen were actively committed to building a social and political order of racist inequality, one that promised them both material and immaterial advantages, along with increased power and a taste of dominance. Thank you very much.